Thank you for welcoming here today, where I can share progress on a project that I've been working on with some collaborators that you see here about the modern and historical use of a small river snail called jute. Our study combines archaeology, ecology, and conversations with people today about how they make and eat jute soup or sopa de jute. I'll walk through what we know and what we want to know to better understand this heritage food. So what do we know? The snails are in a genus called Pachychilus and are referred to as jute, tutu, unu, shute, depending on what country you live in, and are collected from rivers and streams and made into a soup, as shown in these examples that were posted online from 3 different countries. We think that people have eaten soups like this for millennia, mainly because we find jute snail shells at archaeological sites dating back thousands of years, and based on the distinct shapes of the shells, they were different species that varied widely in size. As you can see in this example from Ucanal, a site just across the border in Guatemala on the Mopan River, the tips were cut off to release the snail, which you can see here in a soup that we made a couple of years ago, and the tips that we occasionally find at sites as well. Another preparation technique is to puncture a hole in the shell to release the snail in these much larger samples of shells that we think came from the Mopan River, also from the site of Ucanal. In fact, jute are found at nearly every Maya site. Most research on the snails has come from Belize projects. Early excavations in the 1950s at Barton Ramey, which is by Central Farms, identified 3 different kinds of shell that they interpreted as 3 different species, and this is the model today for the identifications that we make. Studies also have focused on where the snail shells are found because thousands and sometimes millions are recovered from caves and plazas near ceremonial architecture, and some researchers think these may have been left as meals for gods and ancestors. Pachychilus archaeological project members include San Antonio residents who help interpret the thousands of snails found 2,000 years ago and even earlier. Where the snails came from could be the same places people collect today. And here you can see some shells, and you can see part of Tutu Creek where we explored this summer. Not all research comes from Belize. In the 1970s, a scholar named James Nation talked with Lacandon Mayas in Chiapas, Mexico, and discovered that while people used the snails to make soup, it was the shells they wanted for their lime to prepare the masa for tortillas and tamales. And most recently, we returned to Belize for a study using isotopic data from snail shells that could tell us where they were collected, possibly what season, and from which rivers and streams at Las Cuevas in the Chiquibul region. So we know a lot already, but what more do we want to know? It would be important to know what species there are within the jute with smooth and ridged shells. That would help tell us where people got the jutes. It would also help us understand how they managed this resource and a little bit about the health of ancient rivers and streams. And this is where we come to our current project, where we're working on understanding jute use in 4 different ways. One is to understand modern snail ecology by looking at the shapes of the snails and where the animals are living today. We'll then study archaeological specimens, such as the ones you see here, again from the site of Ucanal, and we will do Belize sites as well. But you can see excavations just beginning on an old canal where we found some jutes that leads into the Mopan River from the site core. Next year, we hope to do proof of concept genetics to see if we have different populations and different species within similarly shaped shells. And most important, we can't understand any of this in the past or present without talking to people who use jute today, or whose grandparents or uncles made a really good caldo de jute or jute soup. And we'll begin this in Belize and hopefully expand into Guatemala and perhaps elsewhere. I spent part of this summer locating jute in 10 different rivers and streams to see where they were living, which is generally in shallow water 10 to 15 centimeters deep, sometimes in the leaf litter, other times attached to rocks, where they consume the debris as it flows through, so they can signal how healthy the river is or isn't. I looked at stream and river conditions with 4 basic assessment tools: the temperature, the pH, whether it's acidic or alkaline, the total dissolved solids and the electrical conductivity to start to understand the Jute snails, and then began to try to measure them to assess different sizes in preparation for a genetic study if we're granted permission in the coming. The Jute probably spawn in spring, and this picture taken in June shows an abundance of snails along one spot in the Mopane River, just growing as they start to form their shell. And the maximum size I've seen here is just 2.5 to 3 centimeters. I'm not sure if they grow bigger or not, but I do find places along the Mopane where there aren't Jute, even though the habitat seems like it's right. We also know that changing weather conditions can impact them because just a little bit later in the year, the rains started and then they stopped, and that drying up of the shoreline meant that thousands of Jute died. Flooding can also impact them by washing them to different habitat, and all of these things might be part of a changing climate that we'd be interested in reconstructing in the past as well. In all, I was able to visit 10 different locations from areas along the Makal and Mopane rivers and the streams that feed into them, in areas where people collect today, and areas where I'm not sure if people are harvesting and using the Jute at all. But this gives us a general idea of, at least in one point during the year, how big the snails are. I did not currently look at abundance, but we'll try and assess that next year. I also began to take measurements on snails from archaeological sites, including the length of the snail when possible, the height and the width of the aperture, and the size of that first large body whorl that may be useful in identifying different species. For example, while most snail shells at Ukanal tend to be small and smooth like the ones on top and identified as Pachychilus indiorum, or very large and sculptured on the lower right as Pachychilus glapharus, there also are a number of large smooth shells and snails that have sort of striations along the top but without the ribs or tubercles on the side. These correspond to the different colors you see here with the size of the snails, but we haven't yet analyzed the different proportions. And the reason I think this is interesting in this study, as it will be in all the other sites that we look at, such as Pakbitun and Shinantunich, along with sites in the south by Ushbenka and in the north by Chanchich, is that the snails in the lower left are similar to ones that we find in the Chicubul, which is quite a distance from Ukanal. The ones on the right are similar to snails that are found in the Mopane River, although I have not personally been able to find the very large snail shells with the sculptured ridges, even though people living near the site tell me that they exist just upstream. Identifying different snail species and populations, and of course figuring out where they might have come from in the past as well as the present, is made difficult by the fact that there are more than 100 different species. And here you can see classifications and a catalog made by Maria Gomez in her dissertation in 2010, where just in Mesoamerica alone, you see so many different species that are a combination of smooth and large, smooth and small, sculptured of different kinds. And a lot of these are classified as different species based on 1850s identifications. There was additional work that helped to form some of the museum collections at Harvard, University of Michigan, and elsewhere in the 1920s, 30s, and a little bit later, but some of the collection locations are non-specific, say, for example, Stream in Veracruz, which makes it difficult to understand where they came from and how we might track them either to modern populations or to populations who were using these at archaeological sites in the past. For example, I was very excited when I saw this catalog because I thought it would help me identify species, and I thought that on the left, those looked like the ones that I found occasionally at archaeological sites in the Belize Valley, and on the right, those snails remind me of snails that I've seen just this year in Barton Creek. But there are many different snails that have damage to their tips, different sizes and slightly different proportions, and so it seems that the actual species are very poorly understood today. Even genetic studies are difficult to identify at species level. In this snapshot, you can see a comparison between a number of snail shells that were used again in Maria Gomez's dissertation, but to briefly show you, the smooth shells are those listed on top in blue. Skip the tan ones, which are snails from Cuba, and all the ridge snails are identified in the lower end, but none of them are classified as a specific species. Moreover, Almost all of these snails are coming from Guatemala, a few from Honduras, and some from Mexico, and no species have yet been tested in Belize. So with the University of Wisconsin-Madison, we plan to apply for permission to do some new genetics with snails from each of the major streams where we found them this year, along with perhaps new discoveries next year, to do some proof of concept genetic testing to understand whether the snails are different species, whether they're different populations within species, say in water systems where there's been no connection for thousands or tens of thousands of years. Now, it is possible that people in the past moved the snails around like people do today occasionally, as in the example of one group of Mexican researchers who were trying to understand jute as heritage food and decided to plant some in a river system and see how quickly they grew and how successfully they could be farmed when a hurricane came through, washed them all away, but then therefore putting a new species of jute in a river system that hadn't existed previously. So I hope that there aren't too many people doing that, but it may be that people in the past at Maya sites did that as well. That's something that will be interesting to find out. So with this, we plan to begin the study in Belize, in the Belize Valley, and as well as in the north and the south, and then expand it into Guatemala when permissions are granted. And then perhaps we can get other researchers to join us so that we can start to see how these different species are related and perhaps begin to understand how people used them in the past, as well as manage the ecosystem because of all the information that these tiny snail shells can bring us. And most important are the conversations that we hope to have. Who has a family member who remembers cooking jute? Perhaps a grandma or an uncle or someone who is really good at it. Who collected them? Who prepared them, and how did they prepare the recipes? And does this tradition continue till today? People may remember collecting jute in places that they don't exist any longer, or places that there are jute now that they didn't get them in the past. The animals may be the same size, may have been more abundant in the past, maybe they were bigger before. All of these are conversations we'd like to have with people to reconstruct the history of how people were making snail soup and how can they continue to do that today. Our hope is also that students can participate, especially in the ecological research. At Galen University, we're having conversations about how that might happen, and they may be interested in interviewing their family members as well as a way of passing on this generational knowledge. I look forward to hearing more ideas from all of you about the types of questions we should ask people or the things that you would want to know so that we can develop this as we request our permits, both for the ecological section of this study from fisheries, but also to actually talk to people in Belize and get their input about their own histories. And I hope with this that you learn to love jute as much as I do, and I thank you for your time.